Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Social and Economic Progress. Today's seminar by Professor Aaron Schneider is going to discuss the political economy of high-tech sectors in Brazil and India, two countries that were only recently declared as leading democratic members of the BRICS Alliance of Emerging Powers. This presentation touches on Professor Schneider's ongoing comparative project on India and Brazil, which explores the position and role of emerging powers in the midst of global capitalist crisis and contemporary world disorder. This presentation focuses on a leading sector in Brazil, which is aeronautics, and compares it with a leading sector in India, which is information and communication technology. As per Professor Schneider, booms in these sectors have been the result of combination of open economy industrial policies like the rule of law, infrastructure, R&D, which is backed by coalitions of dynamic domestic elites and international capital. The important point made in the presentation is that the boom in these sectors can have implications for the equitable distribution in the country. And a host of domestic and international factors can disassemble these setups, leading to a bust. I feel that understanding these aspects of the boom in these high growth sectors is quite pertinent to the holistic development of the economy. And these trends have also been seen in the top economies of the world, like the US. Just recently, in his formal address as a president, Joe Biden warned the people of the US of an oligarchy taking shape in America, of extreme wealth, power, and influence that threatens the democracy, basic rights, and freedoms in the country. So we look forward to the discussion on this interesting topic. So we'll first have a presentation by Professor Aaron Schneider. I'll introduce him. Professor Schneider is a professor of international studies at the University of Denver. His broader work focuses on the intersection of wealth and power, and he has conducted research in Latin America, India, and Sub-Saharan Africa. In particular, he emphasizes the study of public finance as a window into the political economy of development and democracy. Professor has published books on state building in Central America, urban development in the United States, China, in Latin America, and digitalization. This session will be chaired and moderated by Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, and we are also joined by Mr. Deepak Maheshwari as a discussant. Thank you. So I now give the floor to Mr. Ahluwalia.
Thank you. Thanks, Prerna. I'll just speak for 1 minute. I want to mention that I was one who initiated the idea of getting Aaron to speak to us. I was very struck by the fact that his research compares experience in Brazil and India and also China in one context, that fairly early on, these countries decided that they were going to try and make a leap forward in a few critical areas. China, of course, succeeded massively. I think Brazil and India are way behind. And I thought it was interesting to have him compare, particularly India with Brazil, because I think Brazil has some very important gains in aviation. You know, the Embraer aircraft, which nobody had heard of 15 years ago, but now is quite widely used. So I thought it'd be interesting to see. I think we need to be more aware of what's happening in other countries. We're all aware of what's happening in China, primarily because China is so good. We're not aware of what's happening in other countries which are a mixed experience. And I thought it would be useful for him to speak. So with those words, let me invite you to make your presentation. You know, think about questions that you want to ask, and I'm going to ask at the end of both the presentation and the comments for a show of hands, who's going to ask questions, so we get a sense of how many people actually do want to ask questions. So, all yours.
Thank
you want to use the lectern?
I think that's where I can go forward and backwards. Thank you so much for those words of introduction and for this opportunity. Professor Ahluwalia and Maheshwari and Professor Prerna. This is really special for me to share some of the work that I'm doing and getting feedback. And when I had this conversation with Professor Ahluwalia, he said, you know, focus on Brazil. We have a room full of experts on India, and they really want to hear about Brazil. So I'll talk mostly about Brazil in this aviation sector. But it is indeed a comparison of high-tech sectors in India and in Brazil, and also low-tech sectors. And that's sort of one of the puzzles to look at is, you know, why is it that we see these different combinations and outcomes in different sectors in the two countries over the past couple decades? So I think I pointed in that direction. And one of the things that we look at and that we understand about developing countries, or that we've observed in developing countries, is that while there are business cycles in all countries, the booms and the busts, the peaks and the valleys in those cycles are much more extreme in developing countries. And there's statistical analysis that shows, you know, the way in which downturns in developing countries, in fact, end up with real busts and setting back the process of development. And what's striking in here, we have these, you know, economist covers and the same observers, oftentimes many observers, you know, see a moment of boom and they think that, oh, everything is done. Everything has been solved. These countries have it all set up, and then a bust happens, and they don't really have a good explanation. So they say, well, you know, if they implemented a set of policies to get the boom, they must not have implemented them enough. For the economists, the kind of long list of economist favored policies is what explains the boom, and then failure to implement them long enough or deep enough or coherently enough is what explains the bust. So there aren't very good explanations for these boom and bust patterns, and it would be a useful step, a useful theory, to be able to explain these booms and busts in a way that makes some sense over time. I also observe, and this is especially the case for the high-tech sectors, that these booms and busts, these cycles, are partly linked to the way in which technology works. In that, you know, if you can get to the technology frontier in certain sectors, there is a medium-term period in which there are rents available from the international economy because your competitors aren't using those same technologies. You've outpaced them until they catch up. But when they do catch up, of course, then the margins fall and the downturn begins. And so that's the moment or the time period in which one has to be thinking about how do you invest into the bust? How do you avoid those downturns turning into busts? And on this, we ought to take a look at the kind of general and macro social changes that have occurred in which technology plays a key role. And what we see is that there have been sort of changes in the way in which the international economy operates. And we're now at a moment where these new technologies really are kind of the key in terms of capturing rent from the international economy. And so if we think about here I have the largest companies by market capitalization in a couple different decades here, I guess 20-year periods or so. So 1975, we have oil, we have cars. And so this is the post-World War II industrial order. And these are the kinds of companies that we imagine operating. And they operate in many countries. They're multinational. But over time, we can see that by 1995, we've got oil, we've got cars, but we also have Walmart. By 1995, the way in which the international economy has changed means that we have a globally integrated international economy. Companies are pulling things out of the ground in one place, transforming them in another, assembling in another, selling in another, disposing in another. So that integrated global value chain is what characterizes the international economy in the 1990s. Beginning in the 80s, now into the 1990s and onward, and companies like Walmart that can find surplus, that can find rent by coordinating. Walmart doesn't make anything, but they coordinate the logistics of that entire chain across all these different jurisdictions, and this is their advantage, and this is why they are positioned as one of these 5 top companies. And we also see information technology starting to emerge. By 2015, Apple, Google, Microsoft, now Berkshire Hathaway, so financial capital is also representing a leading faction here. Oil is still there, but by 2020, now 2020 was the COVID year, so there are things that make it special. But we do know that those top companies now are those that can manage digitalization. I'll say a little bit about what it is that they are specifically doing and what it is that allows them to have this position in the international economy. But it helps us to think about, well, what does it take for developing countries to get to the technology frontier and capture some of these rents and then stay there, right? Because it's the staying there that is what allows you to avoid those downturns turning into busts. And in the post-World War II period, if the international economy was asking countries, in a sense, to participate in these leading sectors, that multinational industrialization process, people have focused on the concept of embeddedness, a close relationship between the state and leading factions of capital that were dynamic and that are operating in these sectors. And the East Asian newly industrializing countries were the kinds of states and the kinds of countries that were able to master this sort of embeddedness and achieve movement to that technology frontier. If we're now focused on these high-tech sectors, there's a different set of requirements. There's the embeddedness. The state has to be in touch with those dynamic factions of capital that know what they need as far as IT infrastructure, or they need investment in the engineers and the human capital to participate in this economy, or the R&D and the conditions so that they can collaborate with international capital, the rule of law. Those are the kinds of things that these sectors need, and they need the state to collaborate with them to achieve that. And that's the same kind of embeddedness that we saw before now for high tech. But there's also a question of, well, what are you going to do with lower classes? You know, and there's a role for lower classes in a way that is different from those previous periods, in the sense that if you're not providing, you know, a universal education, health, those kinds of conditions of life, well, you might be missing out on the next Bill Gates. You might be missing out on the next Einstein. And so that kind of bootstrapping, you could call it, the idea that you're pulling up those lower class to participate in these dynamic sectors and to incorporate them in this process, is a part of the 21st century developmental state in a way that it wasn't entirely in the 20th century for those large scale industrial firms. So we're at a different moment in the international economy, which requires a different set of actions and combinations by developing country states. And you know, we ought to do research and look into the ways in which those combinations and coalitions are set up in certain places, how it plays out in particular sectors. And so I'm going to look at the Brazilian case of aviation. One of the things that I found interesting, and there's a document from the Brazilian military in the 1960s, and I've heard that there's a similar analysis, almost the same analysis from the Indian military after the war with China, which is that there are some key sectors that are dual use sectors that countries will need to be internationally competitive if they are to become emerging powers, great powers. Aviation, nuclear, and electronics. Electronics and computing were the sectors. If the Brazilian military did this analysis, they said, we need to be into these sectors. Now, it's notable that they tried nukes and they failed. I mean, they have some capacity, but nothing like countries like India that have in fact mastered that technology completely. They tried computing, hardware in the 1970s and 80s, just like India, failed, and then haven't really mastered the software exports to the degree that India has. So India succeeded in nuclear technology, succeeded in electronics and computing after failing initially. So we do need to think about that carefully. But Brazil succeeded in aviation. And so I'm going to talk about the aviation sector. Brazil makes airplanes. It's a boom and bust sector like most high-tech sectors, meaning if you master these technologies at a certain moment and can be an international leader, well, then you can capture, you're the only one making those kinds of planes. Brazil is the only country that makes internationally certified medium-sized jets. Canada used to Bombardier, but they sold that to Airbus. And so Brazil really has this market, this niche market that provides these rents. But if they don't continue to invest into that sector, they're going to be Airbus will bring up those lines that they bought from Bombardier. China has the capacity and is now making those medium-sized jets. They're not internationally certified. They can only fly in China and to the Chinese neighbors right now, but they're going to get there. And so, Brazil has to continue to invest into this sector so that they can get to the next boom, right? So as those downturns come on, as those competitors catch up, you have to invest into those moments. On the right, I guess the lower graph is the one that I'll start with, and that shows I'm sorry that it's so small it's impossible to see, but it actually shows from the 1940s up till now. Production of airplanes in Brazil. In the 1940s, the US set up an airplane manufacturing site in Brazil because of World War II. They wanted to diversify, can jump across the Atlantic from Brazil to Africa quite easily. And so this was something that you can see that there's a big boom in airplane production, but they didn't quite learn from that. So in the 1950s, into the 1960s, they tried to create their own airplanes and they couldn't. They couldn't get them to be functional, and so they had a series of failures. But they did eventually get there, and you can see that there's sort of some growth in the 1960s, and then a boom in the 1990s and into the 2000s. Today, billions in global returns, and returns also in maintenance and services. And there, I'll talk a little bit about how Embraer has restructured, given that globalization of production and of the sector. And up top, these are, once again, this is from 1970 onwards, and it shows the number of employees are the bars, and net sales is the dots, and the triangles are exports, and you can see that there's sort of a boom and then a downturn, and then through the 90s and 2000s and an upturn. So I want to talk a little bit about these rises and falls in the aviation sector in Brazil so we can understand a little bit more about what determines that ability to invest in to avoid allowing a downturn to turn into a bust and to surf to the next boom. I won't go through all of this because I know that there was we want to kind of keep time focused and get to conversation as much as possible. So I'll just go through a couple of these periods. So I mentioned that they started in the 1940s with production, but they couldn't quite get to renew that sector in the 1940s, 1950s, into the 1960s. But during the late 1950s, early 1960s, they decided that they would invest in engineering. They created an engineering academy specifically for aviation. They would invest in the R&D and regulation that the state could support in terms of building up the quality of aviation in Brazil. And this investment was decided by a labor-based party, the Workers' Party. It was then called the Workers' Party of Brazil, and the presidency then backed by unions, and they invested into the sector in part because they recognized the bust, and there was this coalition, right? The metal workers unions and the engineers associations, they wanted to have this sector grow, and so they pushed on the state, and the state provided those incentives and built this sector. Embraer, eventually in the 1960s, is a state-owned enterprise that gets created out of this coalition. Dynamic factions of capital that recognize the opportunity in this sector, and lower classes operating in the sector that can provide the support for these sorts of interventions that allow the sector to emerge. By 1960, they create Embraer. They have a couple of jets that they master, that they can sell in Brazil and sell internationally. And what was unique about the Brazilian military jets, they sold some to India also, is that they fly slow. Nobody wants a fighter plane that flies slowly for dogfights, but if you're patrolling the border, or if you're doing training for your pilots, a plane that flies slowly actually is an advantage. And so this was a weird sort of a niche that the Brazilian Embraer found in the 1970s. They're making these particular military jets, and then they commercialize them. They turn those models into commercial jets in the 1970s and 1980s. But there's a downturn in the late 70s, early 80s. The debt crisis in Brazil, all across developing countries, is a moment at which they face real crisis, and they might shutter Embraer. They don't have any capital to invest. And so what do? They partner with US and international firms. They bring in new technology, new capital. And in part, I attribute at least part of it to the fact that the metal workers were a key constituency in this moment of the late 70s. Lula, the current president of Brazil, was of course the leader of the democratization movement in the 1970s and of the metal workers. They were a constituency that you had to pay attention to. And so this pressure supports the effort by the state to double down on its efforts to build this sector, and they do. They find domestic suppliers and partners that can receive the technology from these international firms. They negotiate with them in terms of the way in which that technology is going to be brought to Brazil. I'll skip forward to the 2000s. In the 1990s, there's another financial crisis, in part because of some mistakes that Embraer makes. They go into a partnership with an Argentine company that fails. And so having invested in a line that doesn't actually come on until it's past its, it's not profitable, it's not competitive internationally, that line of production fails in terms of the partnership. Embraer once again looks like it's going to shut it. They privatize. But in order to save some degree of control over the company, the workers and the engineers go on strike, and they demand that the government retain a golden share, and the government retain its interest in preserving the sector. So they sell off the company, they privatize, but they retain a golden share, and they use that to negotiate, well, who's going to be able to enter and buy up shares of Embraer, and what kinds of investments do they have to make in order to do that. And then when a new line emerges in the 1990s, that line of regional jets, 50 to 125 seats, so smaller regional jets. It just so happens that this is timed just right for a change in the US and the European airplane or aviation market, which is that you take a big jumbo jet made by Boeing, made by Airbus, nobody else makes them, to from Delhi to New York, and then from New York to Cleveland. Those shorter flights, you take the regional jets, the smaller Embraer sized at the time, competing with Bombardier, the smaller jets. And so having the international system changes to this hub and spokes model. Embraer has just come online with a plane that fits exactly to that model, and the government invests almost $1 billion into making sure that those planes can capture market share in the 1990s. And this is the next boom that carries Embraer into the 2000s and really into the 2010s. The last moment that I'll describe is 2018 moment. In the downturn after 2008, 2009, there's another moment at which the demand for aviation for airplanes goes down. Embraer once again faces a crisis, and the workers go on strike. They avert that crisis, but by 2018, the Brazilian government, now controlled by Bolsonaro, right? So a very different kind of leader, wants to sell off Embraer. Was to give up its golden share and sell off the company entirely to Boeing for $4 billion, which is a tiny amount. It was really for pennies. $4 billion for this enterprise that is earning more than $4 billion even every year. So it was a very strange calculation, but this is what they decided they needed to do in order to overcome that crisis that had lasted during the 2010s in terms of the difficulty in finding new lines, new technology, new rounds of capital investment. So this was going to be the route to get there. The workers go on strike, the metal workers go on strike. Now, it's notable the engineers didn't. Engineers thought actually getting bought out by Boeing and being sent to Seattle to work on Boeing factories and production seems pretty good to me. And so the middle class, upper class engineer association did not oppose the sale in the way that the metal workers who said, Boeing is not going to make a single plane in Brazil. And they're going to take this production line to Seattle, and good for the stockholders of Embraer, good for the engineers perhaps, but definitely not good for us. So they go on strike. The sale ends up not happening, at least in part because of the labor strife that's happening, and also because Boeing has its internal mismanagement. Their planes are falling out of the sky, the corruption and the sort of the maladministration that they exhibited over those same years. So that sale doesn't go through. Embraer now continues to be an industry leader in that sector, as I mentioned, in terms of the billions that they earn from exports and from having reorganized Embraer. Embraer now is a company that designs airplanes and then kind of coordinates a host of suppliers and manufacturers and service and maintenance around the world. Many of them are spin-offs from Embraer. So engineers in the privatization process, who had been trained up in that public engineer agency and that was created in the 1950s. They work in Embraer for a while, and then with privatization, they left and they created supplier companies and servicing companies. And so they are now coordinated in this network by Embraer as a global company that doesn't necessarily make airplanes, but they do coordinate a whole line of suppliers and producers that participate in the production and the maintenance and the service of these airplanes. I will jump forward just to say, well, so how do I make sense of what I've just described for you? What I see is that at different moments, there are challenges to these high-tech sectors in terms of pulling together those social forces that will support investment in those areas that we know to be important for high-tech leadership. R&D, the infrastructure to produce in these sectors, the investment in human capital, the rule of law. And when I say rule of law, I mean the setup so that international capital can collaborate with domestic capital in order to produce and to invest into these leading sectors, but in a way that the rules are set up so that there is technology transfer, so that domestic producers are learning from those international producers who bring the technology and know-how, bring capital too, but leave it in the country and teach, share those technologies with the Brazilian producers. So how do you get those sorts of policies, those sorts of outcomes? And one of the observations that I have from this sequence of events in the Embraer case, and I'll mention that, I wrote a paper that compares aviation to agribusiness. Brazil is a world leader in soy, in protein production. They have companies that really, that operate globally, that dominate globally in these sectors, but they operate very differently from Embraer. And so if we look at what allows Embraer to boom and then to overcome those bust moments, what we see is that there's always this temptation. There's a combination of international capital, of dynamic factions of capital within Embraer, and developmental state elites that get together, devise these policies, invest into these technologies and product lines, and get to the technology frontier. But there's always a temptation. Especially at these moments of bust, there are declining factions of capital within Embraer. There are groups within Embraer who want to sell it off. There are groups within Embraer who want to become the subsidiaries, the suppliers to these big global companies. And those declining elites, I've called them, are always available and putting pressure on this other coalition. And you can sometimes see examples in which they get together, that yellow bubble there. That kind of a combination can preserve a degree of investment into these sectors. It's the combination that dominates in agribusiness in Brazil. You've got the declining oligarchic landholders that operate with corruption and slavery and environmental degradation, all of the backwards sorts of practices that allow them to get profits, but allow them to get profits in a completely retrograde way. And they're in coalition with those same, dynamic actors who do operate in agribusiness, who have a vision for a modern and internationally competitive form of production that doesn't depend on corruption, slavery, and all the rest. And so in agribusiness, that's the coalition that dominates. That's the coalition that dominates. And so we see the kind of ongoing combination of very modern and very, very backwards practices within agribusiness in Brazil. In aviation, what I described, or the way I interpret it, is that we have a coalition in which that developmental coalition, the upper left cell there, is supported by a lower class group that can organize, that can defend, some ongoing investment and attention to this sector at those moments of downturn. And so we see it repeatedly. I highlighted those moments of organization and strike and the rest. But this kind of a coalition, to my mind, is sort of consolidated or wrapped into, say, the Workers' Party in Brazil. So there's a party in Brazil, the Workers' Party. Lula is the leader, the president of the country right now, but it combines that sort of dynamic factions of capital that would like to be internationally competitive in leading sectors with lower classes that demand things like, redistribution and democratic participation and investment in social policies and these kind of things. So a coalition like that is not easy to hold together, and sometimes there are parties that emerge that do exactly that. And so that's what I see sort of Lula's coalition is. At moments of downturn, those declining elites are always available, right? And it's incredibly tempting. And in fact, if you're a dynamic elite and you're sort of thinking, well, there's a downturn right now, there's not really enough money to pay for those social programs that they're demanding, maybe I should turn in that other direction. Maybe I should form that sort of a coalition. And so you see that temptation constantly in Brazil for to abandon that inclusive coalition. What was true, and I'll end here just to say that if we look at the politics of this, if Bolsonaro, or I should say, if Lula's party, if the Workers' Party represents that sort of an upper class, lower class coalition around a developmental vision for the country, and the alternative is this accommodation between rising and declining elites, what is Bolsonaro? And Bolsonaro has this upper class economic agenda for sure, but they recognized in Brazil, the Brazilian right recognizes that they were losing election after election after election to the Workers' Party in the 2000s, the 2010s, and they got scared. And so they turned to someone like Bolsonaro who says, okay, upper class economic agenda, fine, that's the yellow bubble, but we need to combine it with populist appeals. And the populist appeals that bring in that other sectors include hatred of trans and gay Brazilians, and hatred of Afro-Brazilians, and hatred of those who aren't the right kind of Brazilians. This is the kind of right-wing populist agenda that upper class coalition needs if it's going to be electorally viable, right? So Bolsonaro, he's been barred from elections, but that coalition, that combination is still very much present in Brazil, and it is the rival to the Workers' Party. And so that's sort of where we see politics operating in Brazil. I think I'm gonna stop. I did put the bubble there, the lower one. We rarely see a lower class coalition that doesn't have some cross-class connection coming to power. You can see the yellow bubble, right? You can see that sort of a coalition governing. The lower class one, you see it in Cuba, in Venezuela, places where lower classes get together and try to govern without the alliance or coalition with upper classes is very rare. It's a revolutionary situation. So it's not a huge part of this story. But these are the kinds of politics that I see operating in Brazil over time and how they're relevant to this boom and bust pattern. So anyway, so just to finish up, and here's a picture here. One of the lines that Brazil started in the 2010s, and they've been quite successful at it. They're now one of the few countries in the world that builds military transport. And their C-390 is more fuel efficient, carries a bigger payload, flies faster than what existed in the market, which was a Lockheed plane. I think there might be one European version, but they're 50-year-old models. They're 50-year-old designs that they get updated and improved. But this is kind of a leap ahead, and so they're now winning market share in this sector. India is discussing with Mahindra, if they will enter into this sort of a purchase. So aviation, like other sectors, has this sort of a medium-term cycle in which you have to invest into those downturn moments to avoid having a bust, avoid losing your technology leadership in these sectors. There's always this temptation. There's always this temptation from actors and within Embraer, within society, to submit to international capital, to abandon these sectors, to fail to invest into those bust moments. But there are coalitions that can maintain it. There are coalitions of dynamic elites and lower classes, in this case, that are able to bargain with international capital to continue to invest into these busts. And the sets of policies that people have described as open economy industrial policies, right? Because they're absolutely interested in export. They're absolutely interested in engaging with international capital and markets, because that's where the technology and the know-how and the capital is. Requires a set of policies that I've listed out here: rule of law, infrastructure, R&D, and human capital. So I'll stop there, and I welcome comments, critiques, questions, and discussion. And I'll leave that there. My email is there. If people want to engage afterwards, if you want to come to Denver and do a postdoc or a pre-doc and spend some time, please get in touch.
Thanks very much, Aaron. Let me now ask our discussant to pitch in a few pointed remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Ahluwalia, and thanks, Aaron, for this interesting sort of comparison, and also this whole model about this dynamic coalition between different type of elites, as well as the contestation, as well as the alignment or the lack thereof between the domestic and the global capital. So, I mean, quite a lot of ground to cover there, and I'm not very familiar with the avionics so much, except a little bit that, yes, long back I used to go to National Aeronautics Laboratory every week as a salesperson in Bangalore, and of course, having taken flights from here and there. But I just want to mention like three broad sort of categories. So one is in terms of the, I'll say, the situating the ICT, as you mentioned, in terms of let's say the digital economy in India compared to the aeronautics in Brazil. So firstly, in Brazil, it was initially a state-owned enterprise, a single company around which all the anchoring happened. And so obviously the state had a direct sort of impact as well as an influence on that particular enterprise. Now in India, however, it was a different thing altogether. So in the late 60s, when the IT outsourcing started in India by Tatas, it was a private sector initiative. And slowly it gained momentum like that. Of course, 50 years back, we did have IBM's own subsidiary office even that time in India. But then because of emergency, in 77 onwards, we had a different type of industrial policy where foreign investment, they had to reduce the equity within India. And that's when Coca-Cola, IBM, etc. went away. Now, at that point of time, yes, the government of India did do something very interesting, because they had a lot of these IBM computers and a few others from digital deck. So they formed a company called CMC, Computer Maintenance Company. In fact, it was known as CMC, Computer Maintenance Company, because the whole idea was that because these companies are going away now, so he's going to maintain these computers. It was mostly mainframe era those days. So that's how we had CMC. And of course, later on, CMC got acquired by Tata's about a couple of decades back. But then overall, if you see, India had a service industry in a digital economy. That's how it started. And then, of course, we did have some manufacturing, etc. started in 70s from HCL. I mean, before that, DCM, then HCL, and a few others, Wipro, etc. But even today, if you see, it's mostly services. So I would say that there's fundamental differences in terms of manufacturing versus services, and also a single enterprise, which is mostly state sort of facilitated or owned, compared to a much broader competition and entrepreneurship in the market in India. That's one, I'll say, difference between the two. Second is, in terms of the boom and bust, yes. So for example, in the telecom sector, etc., we have seen these booms and busts in India. But broadly, if I look at the digital economy, not really so much of bust. Yes, the growth has sort of come down a little bit, growth rates, etc., but not so much, especially I would say in the past 25 years or so. Of course, now that with AI, etc., coming in a big way, it could have a major impact probably not so much on the growth aspects of these companies, but more in terms of the employment opportunities that they were generating. For example, we do know that Salesforce has already said that they are going to not hire any engineers in 2025. And let's see what their CEO says next week at Davos in the discussions there. So that's one thing. Second thing, however, is in terms of some commonalities. And the commonalities is what are the specific niches that these countries have identified or sort of emerged, whichever way it has happened. So in case of India, if you see, it was basically the high cost of labor in the US. So people saw an opportunity that, yes, we could provide those services from India. So initially, of course, the data used to come on literally on the physical tapes here, being processed, sent it back. But later on, because of the telecom networks, etc., we could get the data here, process it, send it back. So that was one particular niche in terms of the labor cost advantage. That's how it started. Of course, later on, it became more of innovation. And today, the fact is that most of the Fortune 500 companies, they have their own global capability centers, GCCs in India. And in many cases, India actually has the second largest workforce of these companies. In some cases, even the highest globally, including, for example, Accenture, etc., if you see. So, but if you see also from Embraer's perspective, so Embraer, of course, Bombardier was there. You have ATR in Italy and a few other places. But what happened is that they identified a niche, as you mentioned, that, okay, they do fly slow and they actually fly low. They don't go all the way 30,000, etc. They fly much lower. So they have a different type of fuel efficiency. They have a much smaller fuel tank, but also they are more viable on smaller routes, as you mentioned, because of lower capacity. And that's another thing I would say, that people like Boeing and Airbus, probably they were looking more at a long haul. How do we make the jets more stable and going higher heights and different type of efficiency? So I would say that was also in terms of market niches that they identified something which was very interesting from that perspective. At the same time, if you see in India itself, we had a state-owned enterprise called Hindustan Aeronautics Limited under the Ministry of Defense. This was also a post-independence, one of the early public sector enterprises. And yes, they have created some light combat aircraft after fairly long delays, etc. They're doing a lot of MRO and other stuff. But overall, their focus has been only to serve within India, hardly any exports, frankly. And even that not so well. So I would say perhaps there could be some lessons even from that perspective for India to look at Embraer, which sort of diversified from a military focus to a more commercial and then much broader things there. The third thing is in terms of the way you mentioned in the slide, the way things have changed over the decades or half a decade. Of course, if we look at 2025, we'll probably see NVIDIA there, we'll see probably Tesla also there. But I would say that more than the top 5, which is fine in terms of the charts, if you see a slightly longer list, so let's say 25 or 50 or whatever numbers you have, the longer tail has had more significant changes in terms of the country affiliations, if you see. So obviously, all these top 5 in your case, they were all US headquartered, and even today, they are all US headquartered. But if you see a slightly longer tail, you will see Aramco there, we'll see some of the other companies from other, including some Chinese companies for that matter, in that list. So I would say that's again something which is showing a very different type of dynamic, which is not only US headquartered, also there's a change globally in that space. Even if the sectorally, I would say yes, the sectors are pretty well represented in this type of list, whether it was retail, Walmart, or telecom, AT&T, etc. But if we see today, in terms of the slightly longer tail, then that would be another significant change. So the last thing that I want to say is in terms of within India, we have a very different type of conundrum in terms of our society and economy. And probably it might also happen in some of the other places, but at least in India, it is very visible. So if you see the GDP overall in the country, almost 2/3 of that is services in India. And if we see the employment and the livelihoods, about half of the population is engaged in agriculture and related activities. So effectively, we have this conundrum of service economy, but agricultural society. And within this, the manufacturing is somehow getting squeezed. And despite the fact what the people have been saying for past 2 decades, we have not really made much of progress in the manufacturing, despite a lot of incentives and policies, including the production linked incentive, which has come recently in electronics manufacturing and many other areas, 14 areas that the government has announced. Yes, some impact has happened there, but still in terms of employment opportunities, still yet to grow, especially in the lower skills. And also we, as a proportion of the GDP, again, we are getting still stuck. So let me stop here and yes.
Thank you.
Over to
Thanks a
Dr.
lot.
Ahluwalia.
I think before, would you like to first respond to these comments and then we open it up to the floor? How would you like to do it?
I'm open to suggestions.
I think
don't
that's
know why.
because, I mean, you know, these are
Yeah.
very well focused.
Mhm.
Maybe I'd like to add just one point to what he said. Would it be right to conclude from the Brazilian experience that the effort to do these things in the public sector was a comprehensive failure? That is, there was not a dog's chance of embryo getting anywhere if the Brazilians had remained wedded to the idea of doing it in the public sector. Remember that doing it in the public sector means spending resources, but they end up spending resources when you support the private sector also. The underlying hypothesis, which is relevant for India, is that people will say, look, if you have to support all these goddamn national champions, why don't we support the public sector? So the proposition is, yes, if you have national champions, you have to support them. But it would be crazy to do it in the public sector. I'm deliberately exaggerating because that issue is going to be relevant. And so I don't know what we can learn from Brazil on that issue.
Great observations. Why don't I respond for now and then take some, I'll try to do it quickly, but completely. There was a lot in what Professor Maheshwari mentioned. And so thank you for that. You began by observing sort of some of the differences between India and Brazil in terms of their entry into these high-tech sectors, manufacturing versus services, the structure of the market in terms of a single versus and state company versus a broader and more private sector emergence for India. And I think that it is notable that the ability for India to be successful in aviation versus IT might have something to do with the ability to pull this off, in the sense that if aviation required at that moment in time, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, if it required obviously manufacturing capacity, and it's a very lumpy, I mean, there's really only one big airplane company in the US, right? Boeing, and there's others that participate in Lockheed and others, but it's really Boeing, it's Airbus. So yeah, you wouldn't expect to have lots and lots of airplane companies. They did create several in the 1950s and the 1960s, and it was Embraer that survived. So there was some elements of
some might have consolidated.
Yeah,
probably.
exactly. But they were all state, right? And so you're right in observing that. Nobody else really had the capacity to get into those sectors with the amount of capital that was needed. And so it was the state in those years. It was appropriate, that was acceptable in those years, in a way that for Indian IT coming on later, now the international system, the rules of what you can do to protect a state enterprise and treat it differently than private sector and international companies are much more constrained. And so I think that, the timing might have something to do with it also. But I do think that the difference in sector is something that is notable. And so the process and the structure of the sector looks different. But one of your observations was that, there's been this boom and boom and boom in India. And I think that that's largely true since the 1990s, 2000s, for sure. But of course, India tried to make computers. You described
Yes.
exactly that. They said, IBM, get out, we're gonna make our own computers, and it was a failure, right? And so, but just like in Embraer, there are these, moments of downturn. And the question becomes, well, what do you do in those moments? Do you close up the sector or abandon the sector, or do you find a new way to intervene in a way that's now adapted to whatever the next frontier of technology is? And in fact, hardware now, I mean, you can make a computer and buy one for a couple $100, and after hardware came the operating system. That's where the margins were, and then came the programs that live on the operating system. Then came the apps that live on the programs that live on, and then now we've got AI and all the things that collect and house and analyze and commodify data, big data. And so the technology frontier is always moving forward, as it is in aviation, but obviously especially in IT, and moving forward very quickly. And so there are going to be those downturns. The question becomes, do you give in to the bust? And the failure in computer hardware was a bust, but there was a certain amount of luck and these policies, as I understand it, in the IT sector in India in the 80s and the 1990s, cultivating those software firms. And and building up the software capacity, and in part is because now they were importing the machines and assembling the machines here, Japanese computers. They were assembling Japanese computers in the 1980s in India, and then they had to write software on top of those computers and to maintain and service those computers. So building up that capacity was something that they did invest in, both private sector and government, as you mentioned, and that sort of becomes in the 1990s. Well, internet emerges. So just like in Brazil, there was a degree of luck in the 1990s in the sense that just as they open up and have the capacity to compete in the particular sector is when the international market has created a niche that they can fill. So the internet comes online in the 1990s. There's a need for those who can write software and that can participate in the back office operations of firms all over the world. And so some of it was sending Indians to Silicon Valley, and some of it was sending the service work to India to get done, and then they would be sent back. And so, there was a luck to the emergence of the internet in the 1990s that India was poised to take advantage of, because at the last bust, they hadn't, or I should say at the last downturn, they hadn't abandoned the sector, they had continued. And I agree with you. It wasn't just lower labor costs, right? There had been an investment in capacity in those sectors that meant that they could take advantage of that sector. Switching to you made an observation about the chart and the chart and the firms that show up, and indeed, I think that recognizing that many of the companies that fill out the top 25 will be from China, will be from India, will be from Brazil, will be from Middle Eastern countries. There are companies that have now achieved some of that leadership that I think they don't overturn the observation that the international economy now has located in IT and in data, the source of rent and surplus. But these other companies, some of them operating in those sectors, some of them in other sectors, are now spread across the world. And that is indeed, an accurate indicator of the changing geopolitics, right? So I think there's a geopolitical story to all of this, which is, achieving leadership in these sectors does provide access to rents, as I've described, and that's useful for development and investment in your country and your people and all the rest, but also provides relevance and power and leverage in the international system. And so that power is now much more diffuse in the international system, and that can be described here. I do think that it's these dual use sectors that provide certain kinds of power that we should especially pay attention to. So my interest in aviation, in IT, is not just because they are a source of wealth for development, but also because they do have this role internationally that we should be paying attention to, and it's now more dispersed. As for the conundrum of, a services economy or a agricultural society and a services economy, I guess, or a services-led economy, and the difficulty of jumpstarting manufacturing. This has been observed for the last several decades in India. It is the case that Brazil is going through its own deindustrializing process, early in deindustrialization, people are calling it, and so Brazil is facing some of these problems in a way that India has been facing for a long time. I don't know that I have an answer to it. I think people are looking for those answers. But I do think that studying these PLIs and asking, are they doing the kinds of things that we recognized in the aviation sector in Brazil, in the IT sector in India, this combination of dynamic groups within the private sector and state action to build them up is important. And then, you asked the question, is it doomed to fail if it's only the public sector? And I mean, there's a timing story. So the international system allowed for an Embraer to operate in the 1960s, 1970s, and there wasn't a big question: is this appropriate? Is this gonna be an acceptable partner for the international capital to come in and partner with and the rest? But in the 1990s, that story is a little different, and so there was a lot of pressure on Brazil to privatize. It was that moment of downturn that I mentioned, and international companies wanted to buy Brazilian shares. They wanted to get into the Brazilian market. To participate in that newly diversified supply chain and production process. And that was appropriate to the moment of the 1990s, and it was a successful change in the ownership structure at the time. And I do believe that, there was the need to say, well, was that diversification of the ownership structure going to then abandon Brazil? Because it could have happened, right? They could have left in Brazil only the upholstery of the seats on the airplane and taken all of the higher tech activities and value-added activities and taken it somewhere else. But that didn't happen because there was this leverage that was maintained in terms of saying there's a golden share, we'll sell certain aspects of the company, we'll privatize certain aspects of the company, but we'll retain some requirement that the technology has to be transferred here to Brazil, even as it's now a combined private and public entity. And so you sort of ask the question in an extreme way: is the public sector doomed to fail when it enters these? I think like I said, there's a macro historical change in the way in which that question can be answered. But also, it's less a question of ownership and more a question of, were the conditions of competition and requirements of upgrading there or not. And so it's not that the public sector or the private sector will always be successful or failure. We see failures in both. But if those market requirements of competition are maintained, then you can see different kinds of ownership structures be successful.
Very good answer. That's the classic Indian defense against the idea that privatization is necessary. But of course, it begs the key question: can the public sector show that kind of flexibility? I just want to make 2 points before I ask the audience to pitch in. One, all this talk about, for a variety of reasons, the circumstances in India were favorable for us to do a good job in the services sector. That was true for both the public and the private sector. And actually, that was an area where the public and private sector had open opportunities, and the public sector failed miserably. In fact, it didn't even try. Private sector did fantastically well. I sound like a bit of a proponent of the private sector. In general, I am, but I mean, it's important to drive this home. The second thing is on the medium-term regional transport. And I've been in umpteen meetings from the late 80s onwards to try and get this done. Nothing happened. So meanwhile, the Brazilians have done a fantastic job in Embraer. So I'm really addressing this to the audience. We need to think about what is it that makes it possible in the private sector, which raises its own problems and doesn't seem to make it possible in the public sector. Because I think the question will come back in India in an environment where, for a variety of reasons, private investment isn't taking off. Okay? And so there are a lot of people who will say, well, if they're not taking off, why don't we do public investment? Now, in the first instance, if you're just doing public investment in infrastructure, that's fine. From the demand point of view, it gives the same stimulus to GDP. And most people don't really think there's anything wrong with public sector building of roads and that kind of stuff. But if it goes beyond that, then what's wrong with why not expand the public sector and manufacturing? That hasn't yet come up. But I think we need to ask these questions. What is the record of public sector management and enterprise? And that's really where one needs to compare with Brazil. I like the point you make that they retained a golden share, which sort of gave a little bit of bargaining advantage. So that's very interesting. Two questions, one here and one at the back. More questions. Okay, let's see how many we can get through. Your second. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Montek. Hi, Aaron. Thanks. Wonderful. What a treat of IPE and comparison across countries. So I think we could go on and on, a lot of discussions. But I think the question, Montek, to your point about private or public, it's my first proposition, and I have two suggestions, is that you use the word thinking, Montek. Thinking. You said it requires a lot of thinking, which in IPE means state capacity, strategic, long-term planning. So I wondered to what
I
extent.
didn't say planning, I said thinking.
I'm saying, exactly, you said thinking, I'm saying planning. And you know what I'm meaning? It means state capacity. People like you, Montek, who in the 2000s thought a lot about these things, studied these things across borders, compared, identified the moments, you mentioned, I think, windows of opportunity, I think that's a word probably, right, of the state taking a decision, there's a window here, allocating capital, conditions, the private sector identifying it. It is a certain balance. It's not in either or, to your point, to your provocative question of public or private, right? I think that's my proposition. I think something in Brazil sometimes has worked well. And my question to you would be, what has been the nature of that planning and strategic decision-making from the state structure, right? And in India, maybe that's my open question. Why has it worked sometimes very well? Why has it sometimes not worked well? And I dare to say maybe it is also begging the question, what is the current thinking and state capacity to assess these questions? Current, I mean current as Niti Aayog, as governments, ministries, bureaucracy, research ecosystem, think tanks, etc., right? Because this is really the larger issue. This is the only role, the comparative advantage that the state can give. It's identifying the windows, guiding a little bit, the whole idea of the developmental state, if you want, in East Asia, right? And the alliance, not even alliance, but the partnership between the state and capital to identify more, extend the planning horizon to identify opportunities of growth and all. The two propositions I have, the first one is just, I'm happy here, Aaron, because I think, Montek, again, what you said, it's critical. I don't mean it as a criticism, but your work is phenomenal. But what we need much more here at CSEP, again, Montek, you mentioned in the beginning, is comparison from scholars across countries. So we have an American today here telling us about Brazil and comparing with India. It'd be nice to have also a research ecosystem in India that studies Brazil from its own perspective, and vice versa. Maybe have Brazilians come to us and tell this. But thank you, Aaron, for bringing us Brazil. And I think maybe you can help us also, I guess, based on your fieldwork, identify the right people that are doing good IPE research in Brazil today and on Brazil from wherever they're, but ideally also from Brazil, that could come and spend some time with us, and vice versa also that would be interested in hearing from India, for some of us, hopefully to hop on a plane and spend some time in Brazil and share also our experiences in this country on reforms, planning, and these various booms and buts. So that's the first suggestion I have, just to think. But maybe you can tell us also what you think about the field of studies in Brazil these days, how these things also studied in Brazil at universities there. I'm thinking of FGV, for example, who's doing very good work on IPE, some of the think tanks. The last point suggestion I have is, where could we do more of this research? And somehow what's striking in your presentation is that the labor story in Brazil is more prominent than in India. I mean, in terms of the political economy, in terms of even the political architecture of the country, right? If you look even at Lula as an incarnation of a long labor movement over the last 100 years in Brazil, of which he's a partisan incarnation, an institutionalized form. That has never happened in India, right? So it's difficult to compare on the L side, if you want, of the triangle between state, capital, and the labor, right? Two ideas of where we could do more research, maybe I wonder what you think of, is on the relationship between state and capital. And I'm thinking of two where Brazil that we've not spoken about today. They're not tech intense, but they offer a lot of interesting IPE comparisons. One is infrastructure and one is natural resources. So the Odebrecht story, for example, right, of how they rose and how it collapsed. But a major infrastructure company from Brazil that was active across the global south, building infrastructure in the 2000s, Africa in particular, and then collapsed. So that could be an interesting story with the Indian story, which is emerging now of Indian companies like Adani Group, but also Larsen and Toubro, Tata Power, a lot of infrastructure abroad, energy and transportation companies that are going abroad and facing very similar problems of their relationship with the state. The second possibility would be on natural resources. The whole story of Petrobras, Vale, in mining, two huge companies in the gas and mineral sector that went abroad with a relationship with support from the state or not. I mean, you can probably give us more answers on that. But same here in India, right? The history of gas, oil, now critical minerals. The Indian government is thinking again, should we now acquire mines in Africa? We've been doing some of this research here in the foreign policy program. So that the state, what is the relationship again with the state and private companies to acquire resources abroad? So just two research agenda ideas. Maybe you have any thoughts of whether that could lead to some interesting collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very wide-ranging set of comments, and I'm not sure that you can respond to each of them. You say what you like, and I think it would be good if you were to, after the meeting, have a little bilateral discussion with Tito, because I think, I mean, I would like to have those answers, but we have limited time, so I leave it to you. I think right at the back, we had Partha there. Yes, sir. Would you stand up? It's a little easier to focus.
Absolutely. Thanks. No, this is two very specific things. One to follow on from what Montek said, and one sort of I was just looking up. So from what I can see, the privatization process of Embraer, complicated for the second half of the 1990s, eventually ended up in a widely held company. You know, it's a I think the largest shareholder is about 5% or something, and they're all funds of various sorts. So in a sense, what is fascinating to me is the fact that these companies do R&D, which Indian firms, private or public, so far have failed to do. HAL, for example, still can't build an engine. What is it about Embraer, its management, the manner in which it's controlled by staff that allows it to do this stuff? If you can give a little bit more sense about the cultural ecosystem of the company that makes it make these investments and fortunately successful. The second is I've noticed that Embraer's share price was almost flat for the last 20 years, up and down a bit. In the last few years, it's zoomed. It's gone like 3 times. So what's changed? Is this new thing that moving into military aircraft and stuff that is actually sort of driving it? Or is there something, has there been a step change of some sort that is driving this part?
Thanks. I'll just have one more question and then we can have a second round. So I think gender balance requires that we move to the lady.
Just 3 quick comments. One, because there are a lot of young people here, it would be really great if you would give us a short, maybe explanation on how you did your field work for this. So what was your data? Where did you go? Were you on field? Was it only secondary, etc.? And the 2 substantive comments are, one is that there is, I mean, this cannot be disconnected from the political situation which is there. So your coalitions, as you said, depends very highly on which political party is there at the moment. So what I would like to know, if you have done like an interaction between a boom during a left party and a bust during like a left, and a boom versus Bolsonaro versus a bust, and what would those look like? And the reason I'm asking that is because you could probably, from your historical analysis, then make some predictions to see how, as we are moving into the world which is not pro-organized labor. Around the world, you have leaders who are not at all wanting this. So then what will this look like? What will these coalitions look like as we go into governments that are being more high-handed? And so that was the comment. And I mean, those were the things that I wanted to know.
Great. You want to take, make an
Yeah, sure.
attempt to answer some of these and then we
Yeah.
have a second round?
Well, and I do welcome the opportunity to chat offline and afterwards, and my email is here, and so, hopefully this can be an extended conversation. Great questions, many questions. The first set of questions began with some questions about state capacity. And this is an area that I'm extremely interested in, that I have tended to look at in the public finance way, to what degree can governments raise funds from dynamic sectors, from key sectors, and spend it in a way that promotes development. In this case, one of the questions is, what degree can states engage in those activities, those policies that encourage private sector, public sector too, but into those technology frontier areas and compete successfully. And so there's a set of policies that I think are important, but you're right in saying there's a whole set of state capacity questions. And in the Brazilian aviation case, it was a state capacity built over decades, right? Like, so they set up that engineering association school. They set up a network of R&D entities. So the ITA and the CTA, for their abbreviations in Portuguese, were entities that were set up to build up that human capital and ecosystem of innovation and of research. And so they were, they built that up. It was a state initiative, but it was very much in dialogue with those leading private sector actors who said, we can't invest in this stuff, but we need somebody who's developing the engineering capacity, the steel capacity, these areas. So there was a very close communication and relationship that I called it embeddedness. You talked about, the East Asian newly industrializing countries, and there are labels that people have used there, additional labels. So I do think that is sort of key, is that close communication and relationship to build up that ecosystem. You raised the issue of infrastructure and of natural resources. It's interesting because those are sectors, as you said, that there are big players in India. And so to some degree, in the back of my mind, when I heard you ask the question, was like, well, Brazil obviously has actors in these sectors that are globally important and have been successful. How could those Indian players, repeat that sort of a performance, avoiding some of the, mistakes and awful outcomes that we see from some of those Brazilian firms also. And on that, the Brazilian Development Bank, National Development Bank, has been key. Brazil doesn't have an export-import bank like the US does, so they use that National Development Bank. And that National Development Bank is, almost 100 years old now, and that entity does have serious research and capacity to identify strategic sectors, strategic activities, to then loan money. The Brazilian National Development Bank has more money than the World Bank, and they invest in these strategic sectors. They make plenty of mistakes, and so that's also the case. But they are, in fact, on this, that is their mandate, and they do it. They've increasingly used their money to buy shares in companies, but not in a financial speculation way, but to boost the value of those companies, so that those companies can then outcompete their competitors. And so the thing that is interesting about that is it obeys the market, right? So if you invest in a company and it doesn't succeed in outcompeting its competitors, you've lost that money. And so they're very careful, and there's a disciplining mechanism that they're making more use of, in which the Brazilian Development Bank is buying shares. They call it Benedès par participation, and it's buying shares in the companies that they think they can then elevate to be globally competitive.
One interruption.
Yeah.
Are these family controlled or
Interesting
widely
question.
held?
Interesting question. It is a characteristic of Brazilian and Indian capitalism that you have these peak octopus-like firms that operate in a number of different sectors that tend to be held together by families. And there's a person who has the same last name as me, not related, Ben Ross Schneider, describes it as hierarchical capitalism. And he works on Brazil, works on Latin America, but he said, you know, there's something weird about the way in which capitalism operates in a place like Brazil, where you've got these big family-owned firms. Odebrecht was basically that, for example, that operate in a whole host of different sectors. And it's held together partly because writing and enforcing contracts is difficult, partly because capital markets are thinner. It's held together by families. And that's the mechanism that holds these entities together. But then it gives them a huge amount of weight within the economy. And there's then a whole secondary tier of firms that operate within the umbrella of this hierarchical system. But it has huge implications for the way you operate with public policy and think about developing an economy if that's where you're starting from. And just to move as quickly as I can. Embraer does R&D investigation, R&D work, and there's a whole network of firms that continue to operate. Some of them still public, some of them now spun off. So with the privatization in the 1990s, what a number of Embraer engineers did was they created their own companies, and this was encouraged by the Brazilian state. So Embraer now coordinates. And it coordinates on the research side too. It says we really need people working on this kind of aerodynamics, or we need people to be doing that kind of R&D. So they coordinate that network, but you have many different actors now doing that R&D. And you made the observation, well, Indian companies aren't doing this equally or aren't doing enough of it. It's true that in Brazil, it is being done in this sector. There's lots of critique in Brazil that they're also falling behind. But so I think it is of interest to say, well, how do you build up this ecosystem of innovation in one sector? In India, there was a lot of R&D and innovation that occurred in software in the 1990s, in the 2000s, that allowed India to really take that position. Just like aviation, and as I mentioned, technology is always moving forward. And so investing in that kind of R&D may have been sufficient at that time, but there is a need for new rounds of investment in the next stage, the next stage of AI and big data and all this stuff. And what we're seeing is that the obstacles to getting into these sectors are really high. Only Microsoft and only Apple and only Facebook have this capacity to spend the billions on the data centers that you need if you're going to then run, analysis and AI and algorithms on top of this big data. Like getting that data and holding on and storing it requires huge infrastructural investment, and India isn't right now making those investments in a way that some of these international companies are setting the bar really high. So it's right to worry about it. It is an ecosystem, and it requires investment in each of these sectors in timely ways. Finally, you asked about field work, and then you asked about the political dynamics, and two really interesting questions. On the fieldwork side, I spend a lot of time in Brazil, and I lived there for a time doing my dissertation, and I go back and forth. I'm there 1 or 2 times a year. And for this project, I went and I spoke to the industry associations and the labor associations and the political party entities that are in dialogue as the interlocutors to the state with these associations and the Brazilian Development Bank. And so I kind of tried to get a feel for what the different players thought was going on in the sector, what they cared about. As it happens, I started sort of in 2018, right around the time that the threatened sale of Embraer to Boeing. So it was a very hot thing. Everybody wanted to talk about it. Everybody had opinions. Everyone wanted to talk to me about it. And so, speaking Portuguese and having some history of contacts with these types of groups did allow me to go and do that field work and get the information. And I felt like I could then understand it and make sense of it. And going to Brazil and then presenting this stuff and getting them to say, this sounds great. That part right there is a little bit fuzzy and doesn't resonate with us. that's really useful. And that's why I come to India as much as I can and say, here's what I see, tell me where am I getting it right, where am I getting wrong? I've tried to learn Hindi and it kicked my behind. It's so hard, but I will continue to try and try to get that depth of understanding. But that's an approach to field work that I really appreciate, and I think that it's useful. And you mentioned, we got to get Brazilians coming here and send Indians to Brazil, and there is some of that. There are some people in both places. They're studying the other, but more of that kind of direct exchange absolutely is key. And I'm happy to talk offline about potential contacts and networks and things like that. And then you asked a really interesting question about, are these coalitions only viable under a left or a right? Are these policies only viable? Booms, do they look different? And I do think booms look different depending on the nature of the coalitions that get put together. And the impact, the outcomes of those booms, perhaps the duration of them, but definitely the impact in terms of democracy and distribution and this kind of thing. So, when those left coalitions come together, you do see more mechanisms of participation of democratic oversight and input, and you see more emphasis on social policy and distribution and that kind of thing. And the comparison, I'll make sure that the paper that I did send to our moderators is available to everybody. It compares agribusiness to aviation, and in agribusiness, the working classes, the lower classes really don't have any leverage. So you described India as a place where it doesn't have that sort of a mobilization or capacity. In agribusiness, Brazil, they don't employ many people. The people that they do employ are very disorganized because there's a huge reserve army, just like in India, and the leverage within the production process is very low. And so you see in agribusiness the inability to build that kind of a upper class, lower class coalition that would promote a boom in a way that is democratic, that is distribution, pays attention to distribution. But there are booms. And those booms are pulled together by that upper class accommodation. They've got an agenda for agriculture. It takes a certain amount of investment and strategic action on the part of these actors and the state in some cases, and they're internationally competitive. So they do have moments of boom in agribusiness, but they're not characterized by deepening democracy and not characterized by distribution. And I'd like to say, although I think that we'd have to do a lot more work on this, I'd like to say that they're less durable. In the sense that if one of the things that allows these booms to happen is the ability of dynamic factions of capital in a domestic, economy to negotiate the terms of their relationship with international capital, access to capital, to technology, to know-how, that ability to negotiate, by definition, developing country, dynamic sectors are weak. They're weak in those terms internationally. And so they do need the assistance of state actors that can say, okay, we're going to make sure that when you engage in a partnership with this international company, there's going to be tech transfer and there's going to be learning and there's going to be, a relationship that will allow you to, be dynamic in the medium term. That requires state action that accommodationist alliance of rising and falling elites doesn't really support. They're pretty satisfied that those declining elites are pretty satisfied with their existing international competition and comparative advantage. The idea of competitive advantage using state, incentives and carrots and sticks to move your private sector into those internationally competitive positions isn't part of their agenda. And so you get less of it. So I'd like to argue that the duration of booms is less when you don't build up that sort of a, tripartite coalition, state, capital, lower classes, and, in negotiation with international capital. I think the evidence is unclear. I think that there are booms in all stripes of government. The duration of those booms varies for a whole host of reasons. This isn't the only one, and so I don't think the empirics are going to kind of bear it out in those terms, but they will bear out the democracy and the distributional elements, I think.
One, if I may interject, sort of moderator's privilege, a comment before asking for the next round. On the agro-processing side, our performance, in my view, is pathetic. Massive underutilization of potential. And that is primarily because of the way politics has worked. farmers are not at all in favor of bringing in even the Indian private sector, forget about international. So we're kind of a primitive stage there. I mean, a lot of the people who today speak about giving a fair deal to the farmers essentially want to abolish the market and sort of determine what St. Thomas would have called the just price, make it a legal entity and force the government to somehow deliver that. There isn't, and this is really sad, there isn't a willingness to accept that if we can get two satellites to connect in space, I mean, there must be a capability for bringing in the private sector to do all kinds of things. But the biggest opponents of that, I'm afraid, are the farmers. And a lot of intellectual support for them also. So that's something our guys really ought to study. What the hell is going on? It's a huge gap between India and Brazil. Brazil may be in Latin America generally a bit too much dominated by United Fruit and American multinationals. But we don't seem to be willing to allow even domestic companies to get into it. So that's one point. Look, we are running out of time. That's only a compliment to the speaker. We've got 2 questions, 3, 4. Could you make it a question? The comments are actually fascinating.
Yeah, going
but
to
I
very
don't have
brief.
time.
Yeah, my basic question is that it's a very brief one. It's about how do you see that Embraer competing as far as technology is concerned, about engines with G, Pratt and Whitney, RTX, landing there, avionics, sensors, etc., even sustainable fuels, with Boeing, etc. Because even Connect is also very much dependent, on these
Okay.
Boeing and Airbus, on these technologies,
Okay,
because otherwise, it won't be able to scale up to commercial airlines, etc.
thank you. Next one, yeah.
Sir, my name is Arnab. I'm from ICWA and I deal with Latin America actually. How far has Brazil been competitive in R&D, especially considering that Latin America's record in R&D is not that good, number one. And the second condition being the politics of Brazil. You talked about Partido Trabalho and all. So how far in that context has it been competitive in the R&D sector? That's it.
Okay, yep.
I'm just looking at the word golden rule. But suppose the golden rule is not there. Golden rule is not there. Now, in that case, now I'm just trying to compare, like, say, we have Brazil's case of Israel. Now, we have even TSMC in Taiwan. It's done immensely good in R&D and everything. Only one in them. So, what's the whole point of golden rule? I'm just trying to understand that.
Golden share, yeah,
Golden
yeah,
share.
yeah.
Second part of it is, the whole aircraft technology, the barriers to entry are very high. So I'm just trying to think that you suggest some other technology which has been public, and they have also included the golden share. In Brazil, apart from fintech also had which can you suggest some other technologies which Brazil has? Because considering this is one of the case studies, and really, but it's standard case study. Any other case studies that have come out?
Okay, yep.
Small fundamental question, like, sir, how did you narrow down your study to the aviation industry in particular in Brazil? Like, when we are thinking about Brazil and India, the first industry or the first sector that comes into mind is agriculture, because both are agri-centered countries, even though there's a very stark difference in the technology used in both. So how did you narrow your focus on the aviation sector in particular?
Okay. I think there was one more, yeah, right there.
Karthik.